Secrets in the Shadows. Unraveling the Deadly Affair. Hook. Think the game is over? Think again. The truth is far darker than you ever imagined. Stay with us till the end to uncover shocking secrets that will leave you speechless. Don't blink. This story is about to take an unexpected turn. The night was thick with fog, a chill in the air, cold enough to bite. The city streets were deserted. Only the hum of distant traffic broke the silence. Samantha stood at the corner, staring at the dimly lit building before her. It was the place she had been avoiding, the building where Lori had been murdered. Her heart hammered in her chest. She took a step forward, then another. The door creaked as she pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, as if it hadn't been disturbed for years. Her footsteps echoed in the empty hallway. Every corner seemed to whisper secrets. She paused, listening to the faint sounds. The creak of wood, the shuffle of fabric. Was someone there? Her pulse quickened. She moved closer to the staircase. The shadow of a figure passed overhead. Her breath caught. She couldn't see anyone, but she felt them. A chill ran down her spine. The stairs groaned under her weight. Up ahead, a door stood ajar. Light leaked from the crack. Her stomach twisted. What was behind that door? Was it the truth she had been searching for? She reached for the handle, her fingers trembling. The door swung open. Inside, the room was empty, except for one thing. A bloodstained note on the floor. Samantha knelt, picking it up. Her eyes scanned the words. Trust no one. Her blood ran cold. The sound of a door slamming behind her echoed through the hallway. Samantha whipped around, heart racing. But there was nothing, just shadows. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the top of the stairs. Samantha froze. Her throat tightened. The figure stepped into the light. It was Lori, or rather, what was left of her. Her eyes were empty, her skin pale. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. Samantha stumbled backward. A scream caught in her throat. Then, everything went black. The last thing she heard was a whisper. "You're next." Samantha gasped, struggling to breathe. Her legs trembled beneath her. She tried to move, but her feet felt frozen to the floor. The shadows around her seemed to pulse. Lori's figure loomed closer, its hollow eyes locked on her. The air grew colder, sharp like ice. Samantha's pulse thudded in her ears. Her mind raced. How was Lori alive? This didn't make sense. Lori had been dead for months. A murder case that had shaken the city. Yet here she was, standing in front of her. The room seemed to close in, suffocating her. Her hands shook as she reached out to touch the wall for support. But the wall felt wrong. It was damp, slimy, like something was seeping from it. Her fingertips recoiled. She glanced back at Lori. The figure was closer now, impossibly so. The smile twisted wider, unnaturally. Samantha backed up, her breath quick and shallow. She couldn't look away. Was this some kind of sick joke? But the reality of the scene crashed over her. The bloodstained note, the cold chill in the room, the shadows moving against the walls. Lori was no longer human. Her form seemed to flicker. It was as if she was a reflection in a broken mirror. One moment here, the next gone. Samantha's heart raced as she spun on her heel. She dashed down the hallway, her feet pounding the floor. But the hallway stretched forever. The walls seemed to close in around her. The door she had entered was nowhere in sight. The darkness thickened. Her breaths came faster. She could feel it. Something was chasing her. She dared a glance over her shoulder. Nothing. Yet the air grew heavier. A voice echoed in her mind. A whisper that sent chills crawling up her spine. "You're not escaping." Samantha's blood ran cold. It wasn't just Lori. It was something else. Something darker. She ran faster, her legs burning. She needed to escape. But the shadows reached out, twisting, trying to pull her back. Her vision blurred, her surroundings disorienting. It was like the world was bending. She could hear footsteps behind her, growing louder. She turned a corner, only to find herself back at the same place. The bloodstained note, the open door, and Lori standing there, waiting. Samantha's breath caught in her throat. How was this possible? She had just been down the hallway, hadn't she? Her eyes darted around, searching for any way out. The walls closed in like a prison, each shadow stretching toward her. Lori stood motionless, her smile widening, a sinister glow in her eyes. "You're not real," Samantha whispered, her voice trembling. Lori tilted her head, as if considering the words. Then, without warning, she stepped forward. The air grew thick with dread. Samantha's legs refused to move. Her heart hammered in her chest. The chill wrapped around her like chains. Lori's form flickered again, then solidified in front of her. It was like staring at a ghost, an empty shell of someone who had once been. Samantha tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her throat was tight, constricted by fear. Lori's mouth opened wide, and the darkness inside seemed to consume everything. It wasn't just the room anymore. It was the world star. The walls began to pulse, as if breathing with the figure. Samantha couldn't look away. Her hands gripped her sides as if she could hold herself together. But the cold, the pressure, the darkness, it was suffocating. She stumbled backward, her feet tangling with the floor. Then she saw it. A glimmer of light. It flickered in the distance, like a beacon, a way out. But was it real? Could she trust it? Samantha didn't have time to think. She ran toward it. Her steps echoed in the endless hallway, each one like a countdown. The whispers grew louder, the shadows stretching to drag her back. But the light, it was getting closer, just a little further. She pushed herself harder. Then, the ground beneath her feet gave way. Samantha fell, her body tumbling through the air. For a moment, everything was dark. When she opened her eyes, the world had changed. The room was gone. The shadows, the figure of Lori, it was all replaced with a bright, sterile light. She was in a hospital room. The beeping of machines was all around her. She sat up quickly, her breath ragged. Her head spun. It didn't make sense. She looked around. There, at the corner of the room, sat a familiar face. A detective, one who had been on Lori's case. Samantha's eyes widened. What happened?" she gasped. The detective's gaze was cold, unreadable. "You were found unconscious," he said, slowly. "You've been in a coma for weeks." Samantha blinked, trying to process. Coma? But the building, the shadows, Lori. He cut her off. "You were at the scene of the murder." She froze. The detective stood, moving toward her. "The truth," he said quietly, "is far more twisted than you realize." Samantha's mind raced. The truth, her body tensed. Lori's death wasn't a murder. The detective continued, eyes dark. It was a setup, a show. Samantha felt the world tilt. Her hands began to tremble. The pieces started to fall into place. The note, the whispers, the shadow. The detective wasn't finished. "You were part of it, Samantha." She recoiled in shock. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The detective smiled grimly. "You've been living in a lie." And suddenly, everything she thought she knew, the truth, her life, began to unravel. Samantha's heart pounded in her chest. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. Her thoughts scattered, desperate to piece together what he was saying. She had been part of it? "No," she breathed, shaking her head. I didn't." But the detective's eyes were cold, unyielding. "You were part of the show, Samantha. You were meant to play your role." She recoiled, her mind spinning in disbelief. The detective reached into his jacket, pulling out a file. He slid it across the table to her. Samantha hesitated. Her hands were clammy as she slowly opened it. Photos. Photographs of the crime scene. Of Lori. Of her. Her eyes widened as she looked at the images. There was one photo in particular. A picture of her, standing in front of the same building she had just escaped from. The night Lori had died. But I wasn't there, Samantha whispered. She had been at home. She knew she had been. The detective's voice was low, almost too calm. You don't remember, do you? Samantha blinked, trying to grasp what he was implying. That's impossible. She trailed off, her voice cracking. You were drugged, he continued. You were involved, but you didn't know it. You were manipulated. Samantha stared at him, the words sinking in slowly, painfully. A part of her wanted to scream, but all she could do was stare at the photo. She was there. She was standing right in front of the building, but she had no memory of it. Her head spun with a terrible realization. The detective continued, his tone sharp. The show you watched, Samantha, the one that got you to search for answers, was just part of the act. Her breathing quickened. Her hands clenched the file tighter. You were meant to uncover the truth, he said softly, almost pityingly. To bring you here. Her chest tightened. Her fingers went numb. This is a game, the detective said, his voice suddenly chilling. And you've been its pawn all along. Samantha could feel her mind fracturing. How could this be happening? She thought she was seeking justice for Lori, but all along, she had been unknowingly playing into a trap designed just for her. She felt the weight of the deception pressing down on her. Her gaze flicked to the window, the light outside. Was any of it real? The detective leaned forward. Lori's death was staged, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. But that doesn't matter anymore. Samantha's chest tightened as the room seemed to close in. Why doesn't it matter? She asked, her voice trembling. The detective's eyes glinted with something darker. Because you're the one who's going to die next. Samantha's heart stopped. The words hit her like a blow. She tried to stand, to move, but her body betrayed her. A dizzying fog clouded her thoughts. Her limbs felt heavy. She couldn't breathe. Her vision blurred. The last thing she saw was the detective's smile, a smile that wasn't at all friendly. As the darkness closed in, she understood. She wasn't just part of the show. She was the final act. Her vision swam as the words echoed in her head. Asterisk, you're the one who's going to die next. Asterisk. Samantha tried to steady herself, to make sense of it all, but the room was spinning. Her chest constricted, every breath a struggle. The detective stood up slowly, as though savoring the moment. He reached for the Ford drip beside her bed, his movements deliberate. Samantha's eyes widened in panic. Don't, she gasped, but her voice was weak, a mere whisper. The detective's face remained impassive. You thought this was a search for the truth, he said, his words like cold steel. It was never about the truth, Samantha. It was always about control. Samantha's heart thudded in her ears. The sense of dread intensified. Her arms were heavy, and her vision was beginning to fade. Please, she begged, but the words came out strangled, barely audible. The detective leaned in, his face now inches from hers. He was smiling, asterisk a smile that twisted her stomach with horror star. You think the show was the worst part, he whispered. You haven't seen the worst yet. With a sudden jerk, he disconnected the four. Samantha's breath caught in her throat. Everything felt wrong. Her vision blackened further, edges blurring. She couldn't keep her eyes open. Her hands trembled, but she couldn't move. The last thing she felt was the cold press of the bed against her back, the unsettling presence of the detective hovering over her. And then nothing. When Samantha regained consciousness, she was no longer in the sterile hospital room. The smell of antiseptic had been replaced by the thick, damp scent of decay. She was in a dark, narrow space. Her hands were tied. Her head throbbed. She blinked, trying to focus, but her vision remained fuzzy. Panic surged through her. Where was she? She was lying on the floor, asterisk cold, hard ground beneath her asterisk, and the walls felt like they were closing in. She tried to sit up, but her body felt heavy, uncooperative. Then she heard it, a soft creak, the sound of a door opening somewhere in the darkness. Samantha tensed. Her heart thudded in her chest. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. The figure that emerged from the shadows was tall, its outline hazy. The detective. His face was pale, but his eyes gleamed. Samantha's breath quickened. "What do you want from me?" she choked out. The detective didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step closer, then another. The soft click of his shoes on the floor echoed ominously. "Everything, Samantha," he said softly. "Everything." A wave of fear washed over her, stronger than before. What was he going to do to her now? The detective knelt beside her, his cold gaze never leaving hers. "You've been living a lie," he said, his voice low and smooth. "But now it's time to play your part." Her pulse spiked as she struggled against the ropes, binding her wrists. She could feel the darkness closing in again, but she refused to give in. She couldn't. Not again. Her mind raced, frantic for a way out. But the detective was already moving, pulling something from his jacket. A gleaming knife. The metal caught the faint light, and her stomach lurched. "This is where it ends," he whispered, his voice eerily calm. Samantha's heart pounded in her ears. The weight of the blade seemed to press down on her chest, suffocating her. The room felt smaller. Her breaths came shallow, quick. This was it. She had no more fight left. Then, a sound. A distant, muffled noise. Footsteps. Asterisk, loud asterisk, and heavy. The detective looked up, his expression faltering for just a moment. It was enough. In that brief moment, Samantha's eyes darted to the side. A shadow loomed in the doorway. A figure. A familiar one. Someone who had been part of the story from the beginning. Someone she never expected to see again. Samantha's pulse raced with a new kind of hope. Samantha's pulse quickened at Mallory's words. The air felt thick, suffocating. The room seemed to close in around her, the shadows now deepening with every passing second. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. "What do you mean?" she repeated, her voice cracking this time. Mallory's gaze never left her. He wasn't the man she had once thought he was. The detective who had been so focused on justice, on truth. He wasn't that person anymore. "You've been chasing ghosts," Mallory said softly. Samantha's mind raced, struggling to grasp his meaning. "But Lori," she started, her voice faltering. Mallory held up his hand, silencing her. "Lori was never the victim, Samantha," he said, his voice cold and sharp now. "What?" Samantha could feel her world tipping over. Her hands trembled uncontrollably. "No, you're wrong," she whispered, her mind desperately clinging to what she knew. She had to be wrong. She couldn't have been a part of something so twisted, so evil. Mallory's eyes narrowed. "I'm not wrong. You've been used from the beginning." He turned and paced a few steps before facing her again. Lori was never murdered. She was part of the plan. The whole thing was a setup, a production. Samantha's head spun. A setup? But the blood, she gasped, trying to form a coherent thought. "It was all staged," Mallory interrupted, his voice flat. "Lori was working with us from the start." Samantha's stomach churned. Her thoughts were a jumbled mess, trying to piece it all together. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered. Mallory paused, his face expressionless. "Because you weren't supposed to know," he said quietly. "Your role was always to be the one who uncovered the lies, to be the one who believed in justice. Samantha's head swam. It was all a lie. Her purpose had been nothing more than to play into their hands, to serve their game. She had been manipulated every step of the way. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She was just a pawn. No, worse. Asterisk a tool, asterisk. How could you? She whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. Mallory's expression softened for just a moment, but his eyes were cold. It was never personal, Samantha. You were the perfect candidate, the perfect investigator. It was easy to manipulate you. The words felt like venom, seeping into her veins. What do you want from me now? She asked, her voice trembling. He stepped closer, and his gaze was unyielding. You're still useful, Mallory said, his voice almost gentle, like he was talking to a child. Your job is far from over. Samantha shook her head. I don't want any part of this, she breathed. Mallory's lips twisted into a grim smile. You don't get to decide that anymore. Before she could react, Mallory stepped back, pulling something from his jacket pocket. A small, black device. Samantha's eyes widened in shock. Don't, she began, but it was too late. With the push of a button, a door creaked open behind her. She spun around, and her stomach dropped. A group of men stepped into the room, their faces obscured by shadows, their movements calculated. She recognized one of them. It was the man who had been the fake detective, the one who had tried to kill her, the one she had just shot. But now he was standing there, very much alive. She didn't understand. You see, Samantha, Mallory said, his voice almost amused now. Everything you've done, everything you've uncovered, was all part of the plan. The show. And you've only just begun to understand your role in it. Her heart hammered in her chest as the men began to approach her. You're going to help us finish what we started, Mallory added coldly, his eyes glinting with something darker. Samantha's breath caught in her throat. No, she whispered, her voice breaking. But the men didn't stop. They moved closer. Mallory took one last step toward her. You will help us, he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. Samantha felt the weight of her own helplessness crash down on her. She had never been free, not from the start, not from the moment she stepped into this game. And now there was no way out. She was trapped. Forever. Samantha's pulse roared in her ears, the sound deafening. Her hands shook uncontrollably as the men circled her, their eyes cold and emotionless. She backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The walls seemed to close in tighter with every step. Mallory stood at the center of it all, his cold, calculating gaze locked on her. You're just a tool in this, Samantha, he said, his voice chillingly calm. You always were. Her throat tightened, the suffocating sense of betrayal wrapping around her. She wasn't just a victim. She was a player in their twisted game. She wanted to scream, to fight, to break free from it all, but her body refused to obey. How much longer do you think you can run from the truth? Mallory asked, his words biting into her soul. The men in the room took another step closer, their presence overwhelming. Samantha felt trapped, cornered, her heart hammered in her chest as she desperately searched for a way out. But there was no escape. The door behind her was locked. The walls were too high to climb, and Mallory's men were closing in. She felt the icy cold of hopelessness creep over her, threatening to pull her under. You're just like Lori, Mallory continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her. She thought she could run from the lies, but she couldn't. Neither can you. Samantha's head spun. Lori, the woman she had believed was the victim, the one who had been murdered, was nothing more than another pawn in this game. And now so was she. You never saw it, did you? Mallory's voice was a whisper now, a cruel edge to his words. You thought you were seeking justice, but you were just part of the illusion. Samantha's chest tightened, the weight of his words crushing her. Every step she had taken, every clue she had uncovered, had only led her deeper into the web they had spun. She had been played, her hands clenched into fists, but her arms were still bound. She couldn't escape. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, just let me go." Mallory's lips twisted into a smile, but it wasn't kind. "Go," he repeated, as if the word was foreign to him. "No one gets to leave, Samantha." A cold shiver ran down her spine. The men around her were closing in. She didn't have much time. She had to do something, anything. But the fear was suffocating, and her thoughts were muddled. Then, as if on instinct, her gaze flicked toward the table at the far side of the room. The gun. The gun she had dropped after shooting the fake detective. It was still there within reach. Samantha's breath hitched. Her heart raced. Without thinking, she lunged toward it, her body moving on pure desperation. The men were too slow to stop her. She grabbed the gun with trembling hands, the cold metal sending a shock of adrenaline through her veins. She pointed it directly at Mallory. Her finger hovered over the trigger. Mallory's eyes darkened, but he didn't move. "Go ahead," he said, his voice icy. "You won't do it." The men around her shifted, watching in tense silence. Samantha's hands shook, but she couldn't back down now. The truth was there, right in front of her. Asterisk the lies, the manipulation, everything she had been forced to be part of Asterisk, and she couldn't let it end like this. Her finger curled around the trigger. The men closed in, but she didn't flinch. "Do it, Samantha," Mallory said again, his voice laced with amusement. "You're a killer, too. You always have been." Her mind screamed at her, telling her to hesitate. But the weight of everything, asterisk the betrayal, the lies, the broken trust asterisk, made her fingers tighten. This was the only way out. She couldn't let them win. She squeezed her eyes shut, her chest tightening. The gun fired. The sound of the shot rang out in the silence, deafening, shocking. Samantha's body jerked from the recoil. She opened her eyes. Mallory was still standing there, but his eyes were wide, his hand clutching his side. Blood stained his shirt. The men froze. For a moment, the world stopped. Samantha's heart pounded in her chest. She had shot him. She had actually shot him. But Mallory wasn't down. He was smiling. "It was always supposed to end this way," he said, his voice full of dark amusement, despite the blood soaking his clothes. "Do you really think you're free now?" Samantha's breath hitched as he took a step forward, his grin widening. No, this couldn't be happening. Mallory wasn't dying. He wasn't dying. The room spun again. She had missed. It was all slipping away. The game wasn't over. Samantha's mind raced. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She had missed. Mallory was still standing, blood dripping from the wound, but his smile only deepened. It was like nothing had changed. Her fingers still clutched the gun, but it felt heavier than ever. The room was closing in again. The men were moving, circling her once more. She backed away, desperate to put distance between herself and the predator before her. But there was nowhere to go. Mallory didn't seem fazed by the blood. In fact, he seemed more alive than ever. "That's it, Samantha," he said, his voice smooth, almost tender. "You thought you could escape. But this was never about you getting away." She could barely breathe, her chest tight with panic. The walls seemed to be pressing in on her, and every step she took felt like she was sinking deeper into a nightmare she couldn't wake from. "You were always the final piece," Mallory continued, "the one who would bring it all together." Samantha's legs felt weak beneath her. Her mind swirled with confusion, trying to make sense of his words, of what was happening to her. She couldn't breathe. Everything she had believed, asterisk the justice, the answers, the escape asterisk, it was all a lie. She wasn't here to solve anything. She was here to be part of the show, to be used until the very end. Her hands trembled around the gun. She wasn't sure if she could hold it much longer. And then Mallory took a step toward her, his eyes gleaming with a dark satisfaction. "Don't you see, Samantha?" he said softly, as if explaining something simple. "You're never getting out of this. Not alive." Her throat constricted, and she could feel the tears welling up in her eyes. "You think you're in control. You think you're making decisions, but you're just playing your part in a game that's been set up from the start." She felt her world start to tilt, the weight of the truth crashing down on her, suffocating her. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "let me go." Mallory chuckled, the sound dark and low. "No one leaves," he said, his tone final, as though there was no room for argument. Samantha took another shaky step back, feeling the walls close in even tighter. The gun still felt too heavy, its cold weight a constant reminder of her helplessness. But she couldn't just stand there. She couldn't let them win. She had to find a way out. There has to be a way out. A loud crash suddenly echoed through the room. The door. Samantha's heart leapt into her throat as the door burst open, and a figure appeared in the doorway. A man. Tall. Familiar. It was the real detective. Her breath caught in her chest. "Detective Mallory," the man said, his voice laced with authority. "Step away from her." Mallory froze, his expression shifting from amusement to something darker. "Back off, Harris," Mallory said, his voice cold and warning. Harris, the new man, the true detective, didn't flinch. "Not this time," he said sharply, stepping further into the room. The tension in the air thickened, the standoff electric. Samantha's mind was spinning. What was happening now? Who was this man? How had he found her? The gun trembled in her hands. Harris moved closer, his eyes focused on Mallory, never once glancing toward her. "You've taken this too far," Harris said, his voice controlled, but the weight of his words heavy. Mallory's lips twitched, his smile returning, though it was darker now, more dangerous. "You think you can stop me, Harris?" he sneered. "You think she's going to be your savior?" Samantha could feel the room constricting around her, the space too small, too tense. Harris wasn't backing down, though. "I'm ending this," he said, his voice steady. "Now." Mallory let out a low laugh. "You think you have control here," he taunted. "You really think this is how it ends?" The gun in Samantha's hands shook violently. The words bounced in her mind, the tension between the men thickening. Suddenly, the door slammed shut. A different set of footsteps approached. Samantha's blood ran cold. She knew those footsteps. Another man entered, his presence dominating the room. Another part of the game. Samantha's world tilted again. Mallory, Harris, and this new figure. It was all part of the same plan. Samantha was just. The final piece. Samantha's heart pounded in her chest, a frantic drumbeat in the silence that followed. The door had slammed shut, trapping them all in the small room. Her breath was shallow, her hands trembling as she gripped the gun. The new man, tall, broad-shouldered, stepped into the room, his eyes cold and calculating. It was as if he'd been waiting for this moment all along. His presence was commanding, and the air seemed to thicken with his arrival. Samantha's mind raced. Who was this man? Another player in the twisted game that had ensnared her from the start? She couldn't keep up. There was no escape, no one to trust. The new man's gaze locked on Mallory, then briefly flicked to her, sizing her up. "Finish it," Mallory said, his voice low, an edge of impatience creeping in. The new man didn't flinch, but his lips curled into a thin smile. "I don't think so," he said. Samantha's confusion deepened. What was going on? Why did this man seem so familiar? Then it hit her, asterisk his voice star. She'd heard it before. A flash of memory, one she had buried deep, surfaced. The man who had interrogated her at the beginning of the case. The man who had been present at every scene, always watching, always waiting. This was the mastermind. Her breath caught in her throat. She had been looking at Mallory this entire time, but the real threat had been standing right in front of her. The new man stepped forward. He wasn't just an agent, a part of the system. He was the one who had orchestrated it all. Samantha felt a cold shiver run through her. "You were never meant to be part of the solution, Samantha," he said, his voice smooth, each word calculated. "You were a distraction, a puzzle piece that didn't belong, but we needed you to finish it." Her legs buckled, her body swaying with the weight of his words. What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice a hoarse plea. The man's smile widened. "I want you to understand," he said, his eyes gleaming with dark satisfaction. "This has always been about control, about power, about making you think you had a choice when you never did." The room seemed to close in around her. She had never been in control, not from the moment they had pulled her into this sick game. All of this, the murders, the lies, the investigation, the man continued, his voice becoming more intense. It was all a performance, a carefully crafted show. Samantha's hands shook as she lowered the gun, no longer able to hold it up. Her mind was too clouded with disbelief to even think straight. You're the one behind everything," she managed, her voice cracking. "Not everything," the man said, his smile fading into something darker. "But I've been watching, guiding. All the pieces fall into place, one after another." Samantha took a hesitant step back, but the men didn't move. They were closing in. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice gaining strength. The man took a slow step toward her. "You already know." His words struck her like a slap to the face. The final piece clicked into place. The shadows that had haunted her from the start were finally revealed. "You're the one who sent me those clues," she whispered, her mind scrambling to catch up. "Yes," the man replied smoothly. "I wanted you to uncover the truth, but not the way you think." Her breath hitched. All the pieces, every twisted move, every dead end, had led her here, to this moment. "You were my pawn," he continued, his eyes dark with satisfaction. "Just like Lori, just like Mallory, just like everyone else." The walls felt like they were closing in on her, the air thick with the weight of the truth. "You thought you were different," he said, voice mocking. "But you weren't. None of you were." Samantha's chest tightened, the realization sinking in. She had been a tool, a puppet, and nothing more. But now she was trapped. There was no escaping. "Why?" she whispered, the question escaping her lips before she could stop it. The man smiled again, dark and menacing. "Because I wanted to watch you break," he said, his voice cold. "I wanted to see how far you would go to uncover the truth. And now that you're here, now that you've played your part, I'll make sure you stay." Samantha's blood ran cold. She wasn't going anywhere. She had never been free. She had been a pawn, a piece on a chessboard, and the game was far from over. The man reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, black device. With a single press of a button, the lights in the room flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness. Her breath caught in her throat as she heard the soft click of footsteps moving closer. It was happening. She was never going to escape. The final chapter was about to be written, and she had no part in it. The darkness was suffocating, pressing in from all sides. Samantha's heart pounded in her chest as the footsteps grew louder, each step echoing in the void. Her hands fumbled for the gun, but she couldn't see. Everything was pitch black. The air felt cold, unnatural. Her senses sharpened. The silence, now overwhelming. There was a soft hiss, and then the faintest click, the unmistakable sound of a lighter being struck. A small flame flickered to life, casting a weak glow in the center of the room. The man stood just a few feet away, the flame dancing in his hand, casting distorted shadows on the walls. "Still can't see it, can you?" he whispered, the words like ice scraping across her skin. Samantha's breath caught in her throat. She had to think. She had to do something. But her body felt like lead, as if every movement required a tremendous effort. "I've been watching you," the man continued, his voice low, almost gentle, as if he was sharing a secret. "From the start. Every step, every clue. It's all been a carefully controlled experiment." Samantha's chest tightened. This was the man, the real mastermind. But how had he stayed hidden for so long? "Why?" she asked again, her voice raw. The man's smile was barely visible in the dim light, but she could sense it. "Because it was fun," he said simply. "Watching you scramble, watching you try to uncover the truth. You were so close, yet so far away." Her hands gripped the gun tighter, the cold metal sending a chill through her fingers. She couldn't let him break her. She couldn't let him win. The man took another step closer, the flame in his hand casting long, wavering shadows. "You should have known, Samantha," he said, his tone now dark and venomous. "You should have realized by now. This wasn't just about Lori. This was never about justice." Samantha's stomach churned. Every step she had taken had been a part of his game. The realization crashed over her like a tidal wave. "Then what was it about?" she demanded, her voice shaky but defiant. "Power," the man replied, his eyes glinting in the faint light. "Control. Watching people like you struggle. Believing you can escape a game that was designed for you to lose." His words hung in the air, sharp and poisonous. The flame in his hand flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. "I've watched you fight," he continued, his voice softening, almost a whisper. "It was entertaining to see you think you were free, to see you think you could break the cycle." Samantha's pulse raced. She couldn't breathe. She had to stop this. "I'll never be part of your game," she said through clenched teeth, her grip tightening on the gun. The man's smile faded, and for the first time, there was something like anger in his eyes. "You don't get to choose, Samantha," he spat, his voice darkening. "None of you do. You never did." Without warning, the flame in his hand flickered and died, plunging the room back into complete darkness. A thick silence followed, suffocating and heavy. Samantha's breath quickened as her mind raced. She couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything beyond her own pulse. But she could feel him closer now, just within arm's reach. His presence loomed over her, like a shadow she couldn't escape. "I won't let him win," she thought fiercely. She didn't know how much time had passed, seconds, minutes, hours, before she finally heard it. A soft whisper, just behind her ear. "You never understood," the man breathed, his voice sending a chill down her spine. "This was always about you, about your pain, and now you're mine. Forever." In an instant, everything inside her snapped. With a burst of adrenaline, Samantha swung the gun toward the voice, her fingers flying to the trigger. The shot rang out in the dark, a loud crack that shattered the silence. The man screamed, the sound high and raw, and then the room plunged back into absolute stillness. Her heart raced, her hands shaking as she tried to steady herself, the gun still gripped tightly in her hands. The silence seemed to stretch on, endless and suffocating. Had she? The light flickered back on, harsh and blinding, and there he was, crumpled to the floor. The man, the mastermind. Blood pooled around him, staining the floor, his body unmoving. Samantha's chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths. She had done it, but as the reality of it settled in, something inside her twisted. Was he really dead? She stepped forward, the gun still aimed at him, every muscle in her body tensed and ready. But no movement came from the body. He was gone. The room was eerily quiet now, as if the world itself had stopped. Samantha's mind was a whirlwind, the adrenaline wearing off, leaving her hollow and exhausted. But there was something else, the truth. She hadn't been just another victim. She hadn't been a puppet. She had fought, and she had won. But as she stood there alone, staring at the man's lifeless body, a cold realization crept in. There was always someone else, always another game. And the shadows were never truly gone. That Samantha's eyes scanned the room, the weight of the gun still heavy in her hands. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her chest tight with the aftershock of what had just happened. The man, the mastermind, lay motionless, his blood soaking into the floor, but the stillness felt wrong. She hadn't heard him struggle, hadn't seen the last twitch of life. There was no final, desperate gasp for air, no last-ditch attempt to regain control. The room felt colder, emptier, as if something was still lingering in the air. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, suffocating. She had killed him, but did that really mean it was over? Her fingers trembled as they lowered the gun, the weight of the moment pressing on her. A part of her wanted to run, to escape this nightmare once and for all, but her feet felt frozen to the spot. The walls of the room seemed to close in on her, every corner filled with shadows that whispered of something worse. A flash of movement caught her eye, and she snapped her gaze to the door. It was still shut. Her pulse quickened. For a moment, she thought she saw something out of the corner of her eye, an outline, a shadow flitting across the wall. She wasn't alone. The breath in her throat caught, and before she could move, the sound of footsteps echoed through the silence. Slow, deliberate steps, heavy, like a predator stalking its prey. Her stomach churned with fear. There was someone else. The door behind her creaked open, and she whipped around, the gun back in her grip. But it wasn't Mallory. It wasn't even the man who had been lying on the floor. A woman stood there, tall and cloaked in shadows. Her face was familiar. Samantha's mind scrambled, the memory just out of reach, like a dream she couldn't fully recall. And then it hit her. Lori, the woman who had been dead, the one whose murder had started it all. Lori stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable, her eyes cold and piercing. You're alive," Samantha whispered, her voice cracking with disbelief. Lori's lips curled into a faint smile, but there was nothing warm in it. "Alive? I was never dead," she said, her voice low, almost amused. Samantha's mind spun. What? The truth was falling apart again, breaking into 1,000 jagged pieces. "You've been playing right into my hands, Samantha," Lori continued, stepping into the room, "just like everyone else. You think you've uncovered the truth, but you've only scratched the surface." Samantha's throat closed up. The woman who had died, the victim who had been murdered, was here, alive and standing in front of her. But why? Why had Lori been part of this twisted game? Lori's gaze flicked to the body on the floor, the mastermind who had orchestrated everything. "I've been here from the beginning," Lori said, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the corpse. "And I've been pulling the strings." Samantha's chest tightened. No, this can't be happening," she whispered, her hands shaking violently now. This wasn't part of the plan. You were the victim. You died." Lori tilted her head, a cold smile playing at the edges of her lips. "That's what they wanted you to think. The lie that would keep you in the dark. They knew you'd find the clues. They knew you'd believe you were solving it." Samantha's mind reeled. Why, Lori? Why did you let me believe this?" she demanded, her voice rising. Lori's expression hardened. "Because you needed to. You needed to be part of the game. To think you were the hero, solving mysteries. But you were never more than a pawn in their hands." Samantha's world tilted. She had been used. All of it. Every step, every clue, every moment of truth she thought she had uncovered. It had all been carefully manipulated. The lies ran deep. "You killed him," Samantha whispered, her voice shaking as the realization hit her. You killed him, didn't you? The mastermind. You were always in control. Lori's smile didn't waver. I didn't kill him, she said, her voice calm, almost too calm. But I'll finish it now. Samantha's pulse spiked. No, she screamed, raising the gun once more. But Lori was faster. With a swift movement, she knocked the gun from Samantha's hand, sending it skittering across the floor. Samantha stumbled back, her breath coming in sharp gasps. You don't understand yet, do you? Lori said, her voice dark and cold. This isn't over. It's just beginning. Samantha's body went numb. There's no escape now. No way out. The game had only just started. Samantha's heart raced as Lori stepped closer, her presence consuming the space around her. Samantha's mind screamed for her to run, to fight, but her legs felt like they were made of lead. She had been so sure she understood it all, so sure she had uncovered the truth. But now it was clear she had been playing right into Lori's hands. You think you have control, don't you? Lori's voice was calm, almost sympathetic. But you've never had control. You were always just another piece in the game. Samantha's breath caught in her throat. Why? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Why this? Why me? Lori's lips curled into a smile, one that felt as cold as death itself. Because you were the perfect player, she said, her tone like a caress. You've always wanted to solve it, always wanted to be the hero. But you weren't meant to win, Samantha. None of you were. The words sliced through Samantha, each one a blow to her already shattered sense of reality. She staggered back, unable to tear her eyes from Lori's cold gaze. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing tighter with every passing second. Samantha's mind raced. Asterisk, she's been in control this whole time. Every step, every move, it was all her asterisk. But how? Samantha gasped, her voice cracking. How did you fake your death? How did you stay hidden? Lori's eyes gleamed with dark satisfaction. You didn't think I would let an opportunity like that slip by, did you? Faking my death was just the beginning. You were so focused on the wrong things, Samantha. You focused on Mallory, on the murders, on what they wanted you to believe. Samantha's chest tightened. But why the game? Why go through all of this? She choked out. What's the point? Lori's smile widened, like a predator preparing for the final strike. The point, Samantha, she said softly, was to see who would survive it. To see who would break first. To see who would finally understand what it means to be truly powerless. Samantha's world shifted. Her breath quickened, panic clawing at her throat. She had thought she understood. She had thought she could fight her way out. But she hadn't even known the rules. You think this is it? Lori laughed softly, her voice filled with cruel amusement. This is just the start. The game isn't over. It never will be. Samantha felt the weight of those words like a punch to the gut. The realization was suffocating. She had been a piece, just a part of something bigger than she could comprehend. Lori wasn't just playing a game. She was orchestrating it. Samantha's vision blurred, the room spinning around her. What do you want from me? She whispered, her voice trembling. Lori's smile never faltered. I don't want anything from you, Samantha. I've already won. The words landed like stones, heavy and final. Samantha's world collapsed in on itself. There was no escape. There never had been. You'll never leave here, Lori continued, her tone soft, almost pitying. Not until I say so. Until you realize what I've always known. Samantha tried to steady herself, but her hands were shaking, her body trembling as if she were freezing from the inside out. You think you've beaten the system, but all you've done is play into it, Lori said, her voice a mocking whisper. You were never meant to win. You were always meant to lose. Samantha's mind reeled. Everything, the killings, the clues, the twisted web she had tried so desperately to untangle, had all been a setup. Her role had been decided before she even stepped into the game. Samantha took a step back, her breath shallow, her mind struggling to find a way out. But Lori was too close, her eyes dark with satisfaction. "You've done well," Lori said, her voice filled with mock praise. "Better than I expected. But in the end, you're just another broken piece. Another lost player." The finality in Lori's words hit Samantha like a physical blow, pushing her deeper into the reality of her own helplessness. The door, the room, Lori, the shadows that had haunted her since the start. They all closed in. Samantha's hands clenched into fists, desperation flooding her. She wasn't ready to give up. She couldn't be. There has to be another way. But as the darkness pressed in, the walls felt like they were collapsing around her, and the weight of Lori's words sank deep into her bones. The game was far from over, and Samantha was still just a pawn. That Samantha's chest heaved as she fought against the panic that threatened to swallow her whole. The walls seemed to close in tighter, the air growing thick with the weight of Lori's words. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think, but she had to. This couldn't be the end. She wasn't going to lose. Asterisk, not again, star. Samantha's eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that might offer an escape, a way out. But Lori stood between her and the door, her expression one of cold satisfaction. "You think you can still win," Lori said, her voice low and knowing. "But you've already lost." Samantha's heart raced, the hopelessness sinking deeper. What had she missed? Every move, every clue. Asterisk, was it all part of the plan? Asterisk. Lori was right. She had been just another pawn, playing the game that Lori had set up from the beginning. She had thought she was uncovering the truth, but all she had really done was walk right into Lori's trap. The realization cut through her like a knife. But then, a spark of defiance ignited inside her. She couldn't let this be the end. She couldn't give Lori the satisfaction of seeing her broken. There has to be a way. "You're wrong," Samantha said, her voice trembling but growing steadier with each word. "I'm not finished. Not yet." Lori raised an eyebrow, the mockery in her gaze clear. "You really think you can change the rules now?" she asked, her tone dripping with disbelief. Samantha's hand tightened into a fist at her side, the frustration and fear bubbling up into something sharper, something more dangerous. "I don't need to change the rules," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I just need to play my own game." Lori's eyes narrowed, her amusement fading as she stepped closer, every movement deliberate. Samantha's mind raced, her pulse thudding in her ears. She had no weapon, no escape. But Lori underestimated her. There was one thing Samantha still had, her mind, her sharp instinct, the way she had pieced together the clues before. That hadn't been a fluke. She was a player, and Lori had just made the mistake of thinking she was finished. "You've made a mistake," Samantha said, her voice low but firm. Lori stopped, her expression now unreadable. "You think I'm the one who's made a mistake?" Lori asked, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. Samantha's eyes flicked to the body of the mastermind on the floor, the one who had been the true architect of this entire nightmare. "You've been so busy playing me," Samantha said, "that you forgot there were others in the game." Lori's lips twitched in confusion, the first sign of uncertainty creeping into her demeanor. "I've always been the one pulling the strings," Lori said, her voice cold, "and I always will be." Samantha stepped back, her mind moving a mile a minute. But there was one thing she hadn't fully grasped until now. "Not anymore," Samantha said, her voice suddenly clear and resolute. Before Lori could react, Samantha lunged forward, grabbing the gun from the floor. Lori's eyes widened in surprise, but there was no time for her to move. Samantha pointed the gun at Lori, her hand steady, her mind focused. "You don't control me," she said, her voice unwavering. Lori froze, her eyes narrowing as she studied Samantha. For a moment, there was silence, absolute, suffocating silence. Samantha's breath was steady now, her chest no longer constricted with panic. She had the power in her hands. The game had shifted, and she was no longer the pawn. Lori looked at her, a strange sort of admiration flickering behind her cold eyes. "You really think you can end it like this?" Lori asked, her tone incredulous. Samantha didn't hesitate. "I don't need to end it," she replied, her voice firm. "I just need to take control." The tension in the room was unbearable. Samantha's finger hovered over the trigger, the weight of the decision pressing on her. She had been manipulated, played like a puppet in this twisted game. But now it was her turn to pull the strings. Lori's eyes remained locked on hers, the arrogance in them beginning to fade. Lori's eyes remained locked on hers, the arrogance in them beginning to fade. "You don't understand," Lori whispered, her voice shaking now. "You're too late. You don't have control." Samantha took a deep breath. "I already do," she said softly, and with a single decisive motion, she pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, deafening in the small, claustrophobic room. Lori's body crumpled to the floor, her final expression one of shock and disbelief. The room fell into a deadly silence. Samantha stood there, her chest rising and falling with the weight of what she had just done. The game was over, but the price had been steep. Samantha's hands shook, but she didn't lower the gun. Not yet. She wasn't done. Not yet. Not ever. The silence that followed was suffocating, the weight of Lori's lifeless body on the floor too heavy to ignore. Samantha stood frozen, the gun still clutched tightly in her hand, her finger hovering near the trigger. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, each beat a loud reminder of what had just happened. The air was thick with tension, the room feeling smaller with every breath. She had done it. She had won. But even as the adrenaline slowly faded, there was something else, something darker, that began to take root in the pit of her stomach. She had pulled the trigger. She had ended the game. But had it truly ended? Samantha's gaze flicked to the door, her thoughts spinning in every direction. What now? What was left? She had been so sure, so convinced that the moment Lori fell, everything would fall into place. But now, standing in the aftermath of that shot, a creeping sense of unease washed over her. Had she really won? Or was there something else, something lurking beneath the surface, that she had missed? Samantha's breath hitched as a sharp noise broke the silence. The faintest sound, almost imperceptible. A footstep, then another. Her pulse spiked. Was there more? Was Lori's death part of another game? Samantha spun toward the sound, her gun raised, eyes wide with panic. But the room was empty. The silence returned, just as it had been before. Yet the feeling of being watched lingered, a cold shiver crawling down her spine. She hadn't imagined it. She had heard something. The walls seemed to shift around her, as if the very air was watching, waiting for her next move. Samantha took a tentative step forward, her mind spinning. Had Lori orchestrated this final act, too? Had she set it up so that Samantha would never truly escape? Her hand trembled as she moved toward the door, the weight of the gun now a reminder of the violence that had just unfolded. But just as she reached for the handle, the door swung open with a creak. A figure stepped into the room. Samantha's breath caught in her throat. It was Mallory. Her eyes locked onto Samantha, confusion and something else, something darker, shining in them. "Samantha." Mallory's voice was soft, almost reverent, but there was an edge to it. "You think it's over, don't you?" Samantha's heart skipped a beat. No, not again. The game wasn't over. It never would be. Mallory stepped further into the room, her movements slow and deliberate. Samantha took a step back, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on her chest. She had been so sure. So sure Lori was the mastermind. But Mallory, Mallory had always been there, lurking in the shadows. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. All of this, every clue, every twist, every dead end, had been crafted by Mallory. Samantha's mind raced. How long had Mallory been involved? How much of this had been planned from the start? Did you think you could stop this? Mallory continued, her voice growing colder, more detached. Did you really believe Lori was the only one pulling strings? Samantha shook her head, her mind swirling in confusion. You were always just another part of the game, Mallory said, her voice now full of bitter amusement. Another piece on the board, and you fell for it. Samantha felt her grip tighten on the gun, the reality of it all crashing down around her. The game had never ended. It had never been about Lori. It had always been about Mallory. And Samantha had played right into her hands. Why? Samantha managed to choke out, her voice hoarse with disbelief. Mallory's lips curled into a cruel smile. Why? Because you're the perfect player, Samantha. You thought you were smart. You thought you could outsmart us. But all along, you were exactly where I wanted you to be. The words landed like a hammer, each one driving the truth deeper into Samantha's chest. She had been nothing but a pawn in their game, all along. And now, Mallory was here, standing in front of her, the final act about to unfold. You'll never escape this, Mallory whispered, her eyes gleaming with cold satisfaction. The game never ends. Samantha's breath caught in her throat, the weight of her helplessness bearing down on her like a crushing wave. No matter what she had done, no matter how many moves she had made, it wasn't over. It was never over. And Mallory was the one who had won. That Samantha's heart pounded in her chest, the weight of Mallory's words sinking in like stones, dragging her deeper into the abyss. She was trapped. No matter how many moves she made, no matter how many people she confronted, the game had never been hers to win. It had always been Mallory's. And now, standing in front of her, Mallory's smirk told her everything she needed to know. She had been a piece on a board, nothing more. Samantha's mind raced. There had to be a way out. She couldn't just give in. But as Mallory took another step forward, her eyes gleaming with cold victory, Samantha knew, deep down, that this was the moment. The game had always been about power, and Mallory was the one holding all the cards. You're just like the rest, Mallory continued, her voice dripping with disdain. Always trying to solve something you don't understand. But you never were meant to win. You were always meant to fall into my trap. Samantha's breath caught in her throat. Her fingers tightened around the gun, but her hands felt weak, as if the weight of the weapon was suddenly too much to bear. How? Samantha whispered, her voice barely audible, barely believing it herself. How did you do it all? Mallory's eyes darkened, a flicker of something cruel and triumphant, dancing behind her gaze. It wasn't that hard, Samantha, Mallory said, her smile widening. People are predictable. Fear, desperation, guilt, they all make people do things. All I had to do was nudge you in the right direction, make you think you were the hero, and you bought it. Every single time, Samantha felt a sickening chill crawl up her spine. She had been used. Her every action had been part of Mallory's plan, and now she was the one who would pay the price. You thought you could break free, Mallory continued, stepping closer, her voice almost a whisper. But there's no breaking free, Samantha. Not from me. Not from this. The air between them felt thick, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in, urging Samantha to accept the inevitable. But she couldn't. She wouldn't. A sudden, desperate surge of adrenaline shot through her veins, and without thinking, she raised the gun once more, pointing it at Mallory. You think you've won. Samantha's voice shook, but there was something in it now, something that had been buried beneath the fear. beneath the doubt. The gun was steady in her hands. Mallory froze, eyes widening ever so slightly. "You think you control the game?" Samantha's voice was steady now, cutting through the tension. "Well, I don't play by your rules anymore." For a split second, Mallory didn't move. Her smirk faltered, and that moment was all Samantha needed. With a swift motion, she pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, but Mallory was faster than she had anticipated. In the blink of an eye, Mallory ducked to the side, the bullet missing her by inches. Samantha's heart raced, her thoughts scattering. Mallory wasn't just a player in this game. She was the master. Samantha had made a mistake, and now she was paying for it. But she wasn't done yet. Not completely. Mallory straightened, her laugh ringing out, cruel and filled with triumph. "Did you really think you could kill me, Samantha?" Mallory's voice was almost mocking now, full of contempt. "You really think you can take me down just like that?" Samantha's finger was still tight on the trigger. Her eyes locked onto Mallory, who was watching her with a twisted, almost playful expression. But Mallory wasn't as untouchable as she seemed. In that fleeting moment, Samantha saw something, the flicker of hesitation in Mallory's eyes, the tiniest crack in her armor. Samantha didn't hesitate. She pulled the trigger again. The sound of the shot filled the room, louder this time, sharper. And this time it landed. Mallory gasped, her eyes widening in shock as she stumbled back, clutching her side. The smirk vanished from her face. For the first time in what felt like forever, Mallory looked vulnerable. She staggered, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps, as if the world was suddenly too heavy for her to bear. Samantha stood frozen, the adrenaline pumping through her veins, her body shaking from the sheer intensity of what she had just done. Mallory's hands gripped the wound in her side, blood staining her fingers. "You..." Mallory gasped, her voice weak now, a shadow of her former self. "You think you've won." Samantha's eyes burned with fury, but beneath it, there was a flicker of something else, something harder. "No," Samantha said quietly, her voice steady despite the chaos inside her. "I don't think I've won." She stepped forward, her eyes never leaving Mallory's fading figure. "I know I have." And with that, she raised the gun once more. This time, the shot wasn't a question. It was the final answer. Samantha stood over Mallory's crumpled form, the echo of the final shot still ringing in her ears. The blood pooled around Mallory, staining the floor, staining the game they'd both been caught in. It was done. It had to be done. But even as Samantha's chest rose and fell with the weight of what had just happened, something deep inside her shifted. The adrenaline was fading now, leaving only an uncomfortable hollow. What had she really won? Her gaze lingered on Mallory, who now lay motionless, the twisted gleam gone from her eyes. She'd won, yes, but at what cost? How many others had been caught in this cruel game? How many had lost their lives just like Lori had, just like the others had? Samantha's mind raced with fragments of memories, clues, dead ends, false leads. She had played by the rules, followed the path, yet still, the final revelation felt hollow. She had killed a monster, yes, but in doing so, had she become something she never intended to be? Was the game really over, or had it merely changed shape? She took a step back, still gripping the gun, her hand shaking. What now? What came next? For a moment, it felt like the room was closing in on her. The walls seemed to pulse with the weight of everything that had happened. Each death, each manipulation, all of it hanging in the air like a toxic fog. The silence was deafening. But then, in the distance, a faint noise echoed through the stillness. A siren. The faintest sound, barely perceptible. But it was enough to remind her that the world outside was still turning. That someone would come. They'd find her. They'd find Mallory. And when they did, would Samantha be seen as a hero or just another victim caught in the web. She lowered the gun slowly, her fingers still trembling, but something had changed within her. Something darker, something she wasn't sure she could ever fully understand. The game had ended, or so it seemed, but the truth she realized now was that there was no escaping it. It never really ended, and the real question was, who would be next? Samantha stood there, the weight of the gun in her trembling hand, the air around her thick with the silence of finality. Mallory's body lay motionless on the floor, her twisted game finally over, but the sense of closure Samantha had hoped for never came. The sirens outside grew louder, drawing nearer, but Samantha's mind remained in the shadows. The truth, what Mallory had orchestrated, the lives ruined, the lies spun, had taken its toll, far beyond what she could ever have imagined. She glanced down at Mallory, once the puppet master, now a broken figure on the cold floor. A part of her wanted to feel triumph, to feel relief, but what she felt was emptiness. Samantha had won, but at what cost? She had become someone she wasn't sure she even recognized anymore. The woman who had walked into this game, seeking justice and truth, was gone. What was left was someone who had played by rules that were never hers to follow. Someone who had been pushed to her breaking point and had crossed lines she could never uncross. A soft breath escaped her lips as she lowered the gun. She wasn't sure if it was fear or something else that made her drop it to the ground with a soft thud. The door creaked open, and Samantha didn't flinch. She was no longer surprised by anything. 2 officers stepped inside, their eyes falling on the scene. But it wasn't the gun or Mallory's body that caught their attention. It was Samantha, standing there, caught somewhere between the woman she had been and the woman she had become. The room filled with questions, but they felt like distant echoes, muffled by the weight of everything that had unfolded. "She's dead," Samantha finally whispered, her voice shaky, her eyes distant. One officer moved toward Mallory's body, checking for signs of life, but he knew there was nothing to be done. The other officer stayed with Samantha, his gaze lingering on her, a question in his eyes. But no answer came. Samantha didn't speak again. She only looked at the scene in front of her. The game finally over, but with no victory to claim, no joy to be found. The truth had been uncovered, but it had come at too high a price. The room fell into silence once more, but this time it wasn't empty. It was heavy, with the weight of everything Samantha had lost. The game was over, but the scars would last forever.